Sometimes I'm not very attentive. Things come into our shop and we just put them on a shelf. And when we get to it, we get to it. My father-in-law dropped a load off for us. One of the pieces to me looked like a Heath kit. Knowing that at some point in the future, I would pull it down on the bench and we would get into it. Well, that day came about a week and a half ago now that I'm making this video. I go out, pull it off the shelf, put it on the bench, and get my first real good look at it. And the first thing that I noticed is that it is not a Heath kit, it's a Grommes. This guy. And I'd never heard of Grommes. We all know the big names, but there are a lot of small names too, and not all of them are well known. But I set that aside. Why did I think it was a Heath kit? My thinking in retrospect is I probably just saw it at a glance, thought it looked like a Heath kit, something or other, and just filed it away. Getting it down on the bench and looking at it and seeing the name on the dial plate as Grommes piqued my interest. My father-in-law has good taste. This, to him at least, must have represented something better than, say, the average consumer would probably know. I'm Kerry Gray, and this is Stranger Things Vintage Electronics Edition. What's a hen weigh? About 2 or 3 pounds. What's a Grommes or a Grommes? I don't know. We're going to find out. So let's take this thing apart and see what we have going on. Pull the knobs off here. A little background. We're about 2 weeks into this now, and 98% of the time has been research. So we've only spent a few minutes taking it apart before we figured out we have a mystery on our hands. So I'm going to pull off the face plate, and we get down to the dial glass, just loosely placed here. We only have a piece of glass that tells us this is a Grommes thus far. So remove the cage. Now, back in the day, in the 50s, this was an optional part. Otherwise, the unit came with just what you see and the faceplate. And that was really cool. You set your hi-fi system up, and you'd have your amplifier and you have your tuner. You could see all the tubes. But if you have little kids, you want to keep fingers out or whatever, then you could optionally buy the cage, and you're rocking and rolling. The cage is very well vented. This uses 7 and 9 pin no ball base tubes, miniature tubes, but they get pretty warm. So it gets pretty warm. And on the top side, I will turn this up this way. We just see a 12-tube AM/FM receiver, a 6-section VC variable condenser, nice flywheel design, very nice. Seems pretty clean, very clean here, nice. The chassis is painted, so it was intended to be used with or without the cage. 2 major primary power filter caps, power transformer. What is very nice about this chassis is the tubes are identified, they're painted. So this is already telling me this is a little bit higher quality, getting close to audiophile quality, or at least wannabe audiophile. The painted chassis, the white painted lettering identifying the tubes, and even going so far as to identify the stage, or at least whether it's an AM/FM. This is using inductive adjustment rather than capacitive. Also characteristic of a higher end build. Nice large ferret core antenna, which By the late 50s, this was becoming pretty common. So this is what really clued me in before doing any actual research, that we're in the 1950s and probably toward the later end of the 1950s. So looks very clean, a little bit of corrosion. So I'm thinking, it may have come from at least near the ocean anyway, but it's not bad. But on the bottom side here, we can see it's also copper plated, but also copper is a better connector when you're using rivets, which this one does make use of rivets. On the underside, it looks really very, very clean. Notice all these 0.01 microfarad caps are really mounted. They're not using a lot of long lead, and that's another mark of quality. On these caps, you really want to keep the lead short, so what they've done is they've mounted it right to the bottom side of the socket. So I'm really encouraged that this is looking like a nice unit. So we might be talking about something more upscale than our usual run-of-the-mill mass-produced stuff. As far as prior servicing goes, that I noticed off the bat was the yellow caps here, and there's only 3. Those would have been paper waxies from back in the day. You'll see these all the time in rebuilt radios. The other thing that I noticed is that they had replaced the capacitors, the power filter capacitors. They left the original cans in place, which is a nice thing to do for visual aesthetic and accuracies, to leave them in place. As you can see, it's sort of a skeleton. It's what we call sky hooking, and it's kind of free, and it was uninsulated, but it was fine. It worked. It wasn't touching anything. But we always remove those anyway. We powered it up. We got power, but we didn't get anything through the output. We ended up replacing those caps anyway, but we didn't clean this mess up here where it's all uninsulated just yet, because we want to leave the leads on our new caps, because we're not sure if this thing is gonna make it yet. We haven't really gotten into it, but cleaning up the power filter caps is like job number 1 that we do anyway. And there's a whole lot we don't know yet about this. But that's the only thing that we noticed offhand between the caps and the power filter caps here, the paper waxies, that were changed. We do a cursory exam under the magnifying glass to look for signs of prior service. That can complicate any possible restoration. Even the semi-submersed VC, the third below chassis, means that we're not running wires. We can attach our next component directly to those terminals off the VC without having to pull wires from the top of the chassis down just to get to those circuits. Again, shorter wires, much higher quality in both AM and FM. I'm convinced now that what I'm looking at is probably at least in the low end of the audiophile class. I just know what it is yet, other than the dial plate says Grommes. We want to pull documentation, so we want to pull a schematic at some point. But more importantly than that, we need to be certain of what it is that we have. So obviously we need to finish the external exam and look for the data tag. So that would be the manufacturer's name, model, hopefully. We still have to look up Grommes and figure out who and what that is. So we need the data plate, the data tag, or whatever that's going to look like. If you've determined that this is looking like it's audiophile quality, you wouldn't expect to see a paper tag. That would be, well, cheap. So let's turn the chassis up, and you may not be able to see this because it's black, but the immediate thing that jumps out is we have a nice bold serial number here that is painted on. We have our outputs clearly painted on, antenna, AM, ground, FM painted on. Well, what's missing here? There's no manufacturer information. There's no data plate. So there's no model that tells me exactly what this is. And I have scoured the sides, the backs, the tops, even the inside. So we've got nothing. What do we have then? If we have a Grommes, but we don't know the model, that means it's off to the research library and the archives to figure out just exactly what it is that we're working with. So now we're faced with a puzzle. We have an AM/FM tuner with a make but no model. We have little to go on when pulling schematics, so we're first going to have to identify the model before we can go to a schematic. At some point, we're probably going to need that schematic, especially if there's more things wrong with it than just cap changes, which again looks like it's all been done by someone else, and then we did the power filters again. But knowing the model is important, if for no other reason than to be able to speak to its vintage. So taking notes along the way, we bullet pointed out just what it is that we do know. And we know it's a 10-stage FM/AM component tuner. It appears to be of mid-50s to early 60s vintage. The 12-tube lineup begins with a 6BK7A in this position, which is the first FM. It has 2-line audio outputs fed by a dual triode 12AU7 here. It has a glass dial with the name Grommes on it. It's well built, of very good quality. As we said, it's had its primary filter caps changed out at some point, indicating that during its early life, from the late 50s, early mid-60s, it was very, very well used. Probably had a lot of hours on it to burn these two guys down. It had all of its tubes present when it came to us. Unfortunately, my father-in-law had boxed them up in this box, Grommes tuner tubes. So that left us a little bit short on evidence because we weren't able to see what tubes were installed in what socket. The tubes that were in that box do not necessarily all match what's written on the chassis. That could be a problem. It has a VC positioned below and above the chassis plane, which it's definitely reminiscent of Harman Kardon. It did not have a dedicated AMD mod tube like a 6SQ7. So there's no tube demodulation here to remove the intermediate frequency before the audio is handed off to the 12AU7. So they're going to be using some other form of trickery to remove the IF signal. So we've got nothing else to go on. Running this down as to its model, therefore its vintage, is going to be time consuming. So on the one hand, we have that. But unfortunately, the mystery now is encroaching on our better judgment. When I say our better judgment, I mean my better judgment. This could easily take 2 weeks. But I gave into temptation and I just couldn't, the draw was too strong. I had to know what this is, how it got here, what its story is, and kind of go from there before I make a final decision about what to do with it. So it would be easy to say in a listing that this is a Grommes just by the name on the plate, right there on the glass for everybody to see. But is that really what it is? You know, it's confirmation bias. Just because it says Grommes, we assume it is Grommes. But we have nothing at all to back that up. We at least need a tube lineup to match the model of this maker's radio. We've got no choice now. We either part it or we go off to the research library. And we opted for the latter. Well, Grommes was a contract manufacturer founded in 1946 in Chicago, the heyday of the hi-fi era. Radio was very well established. Chicago and that part of the Midwest were were a hotbed of radio activity, especially on the manufacturing side. One of the founders, Bill Grommes, actually worked at a company called Radio Parts Company, very imaginative name, was approached one day by a gentleman named Harold Freeman. They were going to go into business together to contract manufacture for other OEMs. So in order to convince Bill Grommes to leave a job where he is gainfully employed, obviously Harold Freeman must have had contracts in hand. And Grommes convinced his good buddy at Radio Parts, who was a brilliant engineer by the name of Al Hart, to go with him. So common sense would tell me Harold Freeman had contracts, but he just didn't have the knowledge and the resources to fulfill them. So that tells me Harold Freeman was a salesman of something involved in the radio industry. He bid on and won contracts. He was the Bill Gates of the time, sort of selling something he didn't have at the time but knew he could get. My guess is Freeman owned a building, or somehow they had enough money to rent space, the corner of Milwaukee and Erie in Chicago, and started performing on the contract. Well, as it turned out, the contract turned out to be signal tracers. So they started building signal tracers on contract. Then they started producing signal tracers under their own name. And that's how their name starts to get into the marketplace. Signal tracers leads to other test instruments designed or adapted by Al Hart. And they're pretty successful in those first couple of years. Eventually, Freeman leaves the organization. He's bought out by Grommes, and it's in 1947 or 48 where Precision Electronics now becomes Grommes Precision Electronics. So now the name Grommes enters the picture. At this time, Al Hart wants to expand beyond just test equipment and beyond just being a contract fabricator. They want to have established their own brand and their own line of products, and specifically the emerging market of hi-fi. So Grommes begins to evolve, and by 1954, they outgrow their small location there in the heart of Chicago. So they locate a place to the southeast corner adjacent to today O'Hare Airport in Franklin Park, Illinois, for the next 44 years. And they expand on that building and throughout that business park, probably in other buildings, to eventually triple their manufacturing capacity. So clearly they're successful. The main thrust of their business, what paid the bills, we like to say in business, was contract fabrication of electronic products for other people. Their sort of gravy money or their profit money was the things that they did for themselves under their own name, under their own brand, borrowing designs, work in trade, whatever. They produced some hi-fi equipment and tuners as well. Their first tuner was the GRT-1, followed by the GRT-3 that were in the audiophile class. They did produce other tuners, but they were not what I would call necessarily the audiophile class. They're all very well engineered. But the GRT-1 and GRT-2 are the only 12-tube tuners that Grommes produced. Clue number 2. Grommes, 12 tubes. Now we know GRT-1 and GRT-3. We've got a lot more information to go on now with Grommes. Now it's time to pull the schematics on the GRT-1 and the GRT-3 and pictures if we've got them to see if we can narrow this thing down. Well, that didn't take long. We pulled the schematic on the GRT-1. It's not a match. That's a bummer. The tube lineup really doesn't, it's similar, but it doesn't match enough. So that was a quick dead end. The GRT1 is the same chassis. In fact, it's actually identical. We found pictures as well. Same cage, the same dimension, and a glass that looks very similar to this. But there is one problem. The GRT1 doesn't use a meter, it uses a magic eye. Another difference with the GRT1 schematic topology is the absence of an RF amplifier for the AM, a dedicated RF amp. So it's definitely, it's not a match. It's a match for the basic hardware of the chassis, but that's it. It's not a match for the circuit. It's not a match for the glass. At least we know it's Grommes. We're able to see now they did produce on this chassis. So let's pull the GRT3. Well, we pulled the GRT3. It's still a match for the period. By the way, both of these are. The GRT1 was 56. The GRT3 is 1958. We pull the GRT3 and we have a match on the tube lineup. Well, sort of. We have a match for 99% of the tubes. The front end tube for the FM circuit is the only tube that's slightly different. In the GRT3, it's a 6BQ7A, which is okay. They are interchangeable with minor performance differences, but you can interchange them. So we, for now, can maybe write that off as maybe a later revision. But other than that, the tube lineup is a dead-on match. One of the things the easiest things to look for when you're matching the circuitry is the power circuitry. That's because it's pretty straightforward. It's easy to see. The initial, so that's where we're looking at the electrolytic capacitor, the filter capacitor set up with the voltage dividers and the pi filters and the transformer and the rectifier. And that's a super quick thing to verify underneath. We verified that to the GRT3, and just at a very cursory glance, looks like we have a match there. So we have a match in the circuit topology. We have a match in the tubes. We have obviously a match on the name, but we don't have a match on the cabinet. The GRT3 was not built on this platform. There were several pictures of GRT3s that we came across. Rather than a cage design being a couple of years later, they used sort of a full cover finish design. Also came with angled sides instead of just a square. So they were obviously trying to church it up a little bit by 1958. So we got into the power section. Everything matched. As we moved back now from the power section, we will go into the amplifier section. And from the amplifier section, we'll work back to the decoder section. So we start taking a look at the 12AU7 and how it's wired, and we cannot match the pins, the wiring. It's not a match. They're not going where the schematic says they should go. Sometimes when you're really focused and you're getting down rabbit holes, you start becoming blind to the periphery, things that are obvious otherwise. Sort of level set, this 12AU7 is a dual triode. One triode is used essentially for amplifying the audio right after it's decoded, giving it a little stage gain. And the other triode is used wired in such a way that's referred to as a cathode follower. And the purpose of wiring a triode that way is to bring it to a line level like voltage. So it's a cathode follower. And it dawned on me, well, what if they just switch the pin wiring for whatever reason, And so when I flipped the chassis over and started swapping the pins from schematic to the other side of the tube, that seems to work. Now everything traces out. Seems to make good sense. Okay, so put that aside, why they flipped that. And so we go back to the next section, starting with the AM decoder section. It's a diode. It's a crystal diode. So crystal diode is what the GRT3 is using to remove the IF envelope. That should be real easy to find, and that's a real good landmark. I probably spent the better part of an hour, and I couldn't find a diode anywhere. And it really shouldn't have been that hard to find. In fact, following their own logic of keeping things close to where they need to tie off, there is no diode. If there is no diode, this isn't a GRT3. So we're back to square one. Before we go to bed and sleep on this discovery, we go back to the GRT1 schematic. So they're using an RC network, which is a tricky way. It's to save a tube. I don't think anybody considers it the most effective way to do it, but it does. And the component number there is RC52. So looking under this, we start looking for a component that is a resistor capacitor network. And lo and behold, right where the diode should have been, we find a component that we had seen before. We just thought it was a typical resistor capacitor network, which it is. It's just very small. And right stamped there on the body, RC52. So we have a GRT1 decoding style, a GRT1 cabinet, but a GRT3 tube lineup, almost perfectly identical, including the meter. The GRT3 uses a meter in the lower left corner, where the GRT1 is a magic eye. Time to go sleep on this again, wake up tomorrow, and let all the information sort of gel and try to point us to a new direction. We're going to compare topologies. So we were able to pull in our earlier research a lot of photographs so that we had a real good baseline from what to work from with the historical artifact. So the easiest thing in the world to do is to map the top side topology of where things are, specifically big critical pieces. That would be the power transformer, position of the filter caps, and if necessary, even the position of the VC, the variable condenser. But I think that we can do this based off the transformer and the filter caps to start with and just see where that leads. I'm going to look for the position of the power transformer on the top side of the chassis, with 0, 0 being the upper leftmost corner. And then I'm going to position hours on a plot and then plot the photographic evidence I have of both the GRT1 and GRT3. So on hours, I have 1, 0, 1 in being one theoretical segment, and 0. So it's at the edge, the top edge, but inset. I look at the GRT1, and it is the exact opposite. It is down 1, but against the leftmost edge. Not a GRT1. Proof positive. Plus the fact that it has an eye tube. And the reason the transformer is over and down is to accommodate that eye tube, which would otherwise interfere with it. So let's go to the GRT3. Well, the GRT3, well, that's easy. That's right at the edge, the top of the leftmost edge. Not a match. Neither the GRT1 or the GRT3 had the filter caps, that was the next thing to look at, in the correct orientation. The filter caps on this model that we're looking at are vertical to the front view, so they're up and down. On the GRT1 and the GRT3 both, they are horizontal to the front view. Proof positive. We don't need to go any further. Despite the fact that this says Grommes, it is not a GRT1. It is not a GRT3. Those are the only GRT 12 tube tuners, standalone, that Grommes ever made under their own name. So we can confidently say that even though it's not a Grommes product that they marketed, it is Grommes built. So with all of that in hand, just exactly what is this then? And for that, we will need to go back to the archives. So back to the hunting we go. Fortunately, Grommes is still in business. They have a website still up. I was able to get to some other pages, sort of confirmed what I was thinking up to this point. One of the interesting things on their historical page is that there are a few pictures. There's also a picture of what was called the high fidelity board. And in this picture is Bill Grommes standing in the corner, and Sidney Harman, who is the president at the time this picture is taken, is there, as well as Stanton, the head of Stanton, and some others that were big names in hi-fi during the era. They're all members of this manufacturing board. And the purpose of this board is, yes, they're all competitors to some degree, but they work in different spaces. But they all realize the importance of standardization amongst themselves for interoperability. And that was really the purpose of this board. This board still exists. It's been evolved and absorbed in other boards, and today exists as, I can't remember the acronym. But clearly from this photograph, Sidney Harman and Bill Grommes are contemporaries. They're obviously friends and they work together. So Harman Kardon's in hi-fi, Grommes is in hi-fi. I kind of start there with my new approach. If you're a member of the board, this is how deals are done. So what are the chances that one or more of these principles that Bill Grommes is mixing with may have contracted Grommes to build for them? Well, the most obvious place to start is Sidney Harman. Let's dig into Harman Kardon. Harman Kardon was founded in 1954, about 7 years after Grommes. So Grommes is well established. Also, very well established. They moved to that much larger facility in 1954. So in 54, Harman Kardon is founded, very small building, only large enough to really accommodate marketing, running the business operations, putting together raw product, packing and shipping and fulfilling to their dealer network, warranty repairs and things like that coming back in. It's definitely not big enough for manufacturing. So if Harman Kardon is putting out products, who's doing the work? More than likely, Harman Kardon is using a handful of contract manufacturers for different products. But they didn't have a tuner up until 1956. Their focus was integrated and component stereo systems, specifically amplifiers. But they didn't have a tuner. They wanted a tuner. So in 1956, they need a contract manufacturer to fabricate the A-310, the first tuner from Harman Kardon. Let's pull the photos and pull the schematic for the A-310. It's about to get good. It's all going to come together. It's all going to make sense in the end. So to level set, we found the Grommes GRT1 in the March 1956 SAMs. So that's the early edition of 56, which matched the cabinet, but nothing else. When we found the A310 Harman Kardon, we found that in the October 56 SAMs. And just to rope it in, since I mentioned it earlier, the GRT3, which we knew was a later model, was found in the March 1958 SAMs. The GRT3 is a match for the circuit on the top side, as far as the tube layout only. So we pull the A310, we pull the schematics, we pull the photos, bring them to the bench, and start our quick comparison. Well, let's start with the easiest thing first. Let's start off the top. So we get our photo and we compare it to our bench unit, and we find two very interesting things. The transformer is in exactly this position. Let's move to the electrolytics. Remember I said in the earlier segment, the GRT 1 and 3, the electrolytics were horizontal. The Harman Kardon A-310 in exactly this orientation, vertical or perpendicular to the front face. Interesting. Tube layout, 6BE6, 6AB6, 6X4, 6ALL5 discriminator. Right on the money. All the tubes are in the exact same position. It's starting to get good. Don't want to get too excited yet. Front fascia. Dead ringer. Square, blocky, full size, inset. Match for the Harman Kardon A-310. Go to the cage. Black, fully vented, 100% match. Dimension, look, 100% match to the A310. We have 100% dead ringer on the physical platform, including the layout of the components topside. When we look at the schematic, that tube lineup matches 100% in SAMs. We go to the underside, see how the 12AU7 is wired. Remember that flipping, it's a dual triode, is an identical match. The cathode follower is using the right section that this one is wired for. That's encouraging. The A310 schematic does not use a diode. This does not use a diode. The A310 uses an RC network, the PC52. That's encouraging. This is beginning to make us think that what we have here is a prototype. So that would be a model built by Grommes for Harman Kardon's review and acceptance before production. And it appears that this is based on the GRT1 with changes that Harman Kardon likely had ordered. That would be the meter instead of the tube. They ordered an RF amp on the AM. It appears then, bottom line, that the Harman Kardon A310 is derivative of the earlier released Grommes GRT1. So when Grommes got the contract then in 56, presuming, this is one of those presuming, they get a contract from Harman Kardon to build their first tuner, the A310. They naturally say, well, we've got a 12-tube superhet, the GRT1, let's not reinvent the wheel, let's just start from that. Here's the engineering specs, how do you want to change it up? So they change it up, and ironically what they change it to is much more similar to the GRT3 from Grommes, which came out 2 years later. The Harman Kardon A310 is clearly derivative of the Grommes GRT1. The A310, or the GRT3 Grommes, then is derivative of the A310. This is just economy. The GRT3 is virtually identical to the A310, but remember it came out 2 years later with just minor modifications. Actually, it's a little less performer than the A310, obviously, because Grommes is, Harman Kardon is their customer. They can put out a like tuner, but it can't be better than what they're building for their customer. There are a couple of areas where Grommes purposely sort of dumbed it down, for lack of a better phrase, made it a little less of a performer, but still in that class. That, there's nothing surprising there. So pretty sure that's the progression. The last thing that we need to do to sort of prove our theory at this point is we need to find a copy of the A310 user manual, which in those days often included a schematic, and we're hoping it does. We already have the SAMs. It's a dead ringer for the A310. So back to the archives one last time, and let's see if we can get a user manual for the A310. But before we go to the archives, let's first hop on eBay and see if some hapless eBayer has posted a user manual for the A310, complete with a picture of the schematic, to give us at least a presumptive view of what it might look like before we go try to find it off the internet. So that only takes about 30 seconds, and we find several hapless eBayers gladly showing pictures of the user manual for the A310, and right there on the front cover is a picture, and it's identical in its completed form as ours. They post a picture of the very back page, which is the schematic diagram. So we blow that up, and we're really excited because this, starting from the power section backwards, looks identical to now the schematic for the A310. Now what we have on the bench, they're all lining up. So we go through the tube lineup. Everything is looking good till we get to that first FM tube. According to the user manual for the A310, the first FM tube is a 6AN4. So where the 6BQ7A and the 6BK7A are interchangeable, they're both dual triodes, the 6AN4 is a single triode, a completely different animal. It is a much better tube for FM and VHF, and that's what it was created for. So why is it on the schematic of the A310 user manual but not in the SAMs? What could explain this? So going to harmankardon.com, lo and behold, they maintain an archive. And within that archive is the original user manual for the A310, right there for everybody to get. But why pay for it when you can get it from harmankardon.com for free? So that's what we did. We downloaded it, and sure enough, proof positive, the A310 shows a 6AN4 in the first position for the FM side. Bummer. So we have, in all other aspects, an A310 with a Grommes dial plate, no manufacturer markings, and the wrong tube in the first position. So as it turns out, obviously SAMS is a well-known publisher of engineering and technical documentation for the serviceman. What could explain then this discrepancy between the SAMS, which was published October of '56 for the A310, showing the R tube in that position, and the A310 user manual, which obviously was produced in late '56 to go out with the products they're shipping, which shows the 6AN4 in that first position, and maybe even some minor circuit changes elsewhere throughout at least the FM side to accommodate the 6AN4. Well, remember, Harman Kardon is a manufacturer in that they design, engineer, support, and do quality for their designs. They don't actually build it themselves. That's contracted out, people like Grommes. But their focus is the dealer network. One could presume that the user manual was printed in the later part of 1956, where the schematics submitted to SAMS for the same time period, for the October '56 edition, would have had to have been submitted to SAMS much earlier in the year. So it stands to reason that if Harman Kardon was working with Grommes to bring the A310 out in late 56, and it's based on the GRT-1, that the only engineering documents they would have had in May, June would be basically the schematic for the GRT-1, just relabeled Harman Kardon A-310. Makes sense. They knew what they were doing, but they didn't have the final designs yet. They had the initial design, the GRT-1 basis, adapted for Harman Kardon requirements, and that's what they submitted. But something happened over the summer of 1956. The 6AN4 was released. The 6AN4 is a single triode, a much superior tube to this guy. And so the theory now, or what probably happened, is that once this tube was released and before production began on the A310 in earnest, Harman Kardon simply ordered a change request to Grommes, the contract manufacturer. A change request is common. Let's not go out with something that's been around for a while. Let's go out with something far superior and better. So likely they issued a change request after they submitted their engineering documents, but before they began production, to Grommes to change that front end tube, which they did. Harman Kardon produced the user manual, and they put it all together at Harman Kardon's plant and ship it into the dealer network from there. Can't prove any of that. There's really no way to prove that, but that happens all the time. That's not unusual. So probably that is what happened. So bottom line, HK contracted Grommes for their tuner to be released in late 56. Okay. Grommes uses a GRT-1 as the basis. They agree on that. Harman Kardon orders some changes to that circuit. Grommes does that, draws that up. That's what they're planning to go with. The deadline to make the October SAMs is approaching. Harman Kardon submits what they've got thus far from Grommes, this exact model on the bench to SAMs. During the summer of 56, the 6AN4 is released. Harman Kardon orders a design change to the front end of the FM using the 6AN4, vastly superior. Grommes does that, updates the schematic, sends it to Harman Kardon, and is now ready to start production for Harman Kardon and get these things out before the Christmas season of 56. All well and good. HK approves it. Grommes goes to work and starts pumping these things out with the 6AN4 in the front end. Meanwhile, Harman Kardon starts producing the user manual, getting the boxing, getting the packing, getting the power cord, getting all the what goes in the box stuff together for fulfillment when the first shipments from Grommes comes in. Yeah, I don't think you need any artifact to prove that that's what happened. That is almost certainly what happened. And if you accept that, then that explains why there's a discrepancy between the SAMs schematic of the A310, which looks exactly like this unit here, and what they actually ship to the dealers, which has a different schematic and in fact does not look like this regarding the front end AFM or the front end FM tube. The only change. So if we accept all that we have discovered thus far to this point, then we only have two questions that remain unanswered. We have a plate that reads Grommes, yet Grommes never produced this under their own name for sale. That's a fact. We also have absolutely zero maker's marks. We know it's a Grommes, but we don't have the manufacturer data plate. It was never there. So our presumption then is that what we're looking at, based on all the evidence that we have thus far, It appears that what we have here on the bench is actually a prototype. I don't think that there's reasonably any other conclusion that can be drawn with the amount of research, the data that we do have, that is factual, and just common knowledge from the industry of what happens, progression of events, when you're using a contract builder. We can presume then, with probably the highest degree of probability that one will ever attain, that what we're looking at here is a prototype of the A310 as manufactured by Grommes before the 6AN5 or 6AN4 came out and the design change was implemented. So this is an early prototype of the A310 Harman Kardon as built, manufactured by Grommes. That's the bottom line. And where can I go from there? Well, this unit came, as I said earlier, came to me by way of my father-in-law, who bought it off eBay. My thinking is, in order for this to exist, it had to come from a principal or their estate. That's the only person who could possibly have a specification model, that one not ever intended for retail. I am pretty confident that it came from an estate of a founding principal of either Harman Kardon or Grommes, most likely. Second most likely is some lower level lackey engineer either at Harman Kardon or Grommes, just simply took it home and thought it was cool, or was given to them, or who knows. Just because it was sold to my father-in-law in 2002 doesn't mean it wasn't sold even earlier by someone else. That eBayer could have bought it from a garage sale, or another eBayer. So we're kind of sort of cut off now at that point. We can only make a very loose assumption, but it's founded on the basis that not just everybody is going to have a prototype, which is an internal intellectual property. Not often do these get out of the company. So it's pretty controlled. So for this prototype of the Harman Kardon A-310 to get out is what's interesting. And I don't think I'll ever be able to go any further with the leads that I have to answer the question as to why it's on my bench. I've now answered the question as to what is on my bench, but I have not yet answered, and probably never will be able to answer, is how did it get here? Why it's on my bench, how did it get here? I guess I can answer why it came from my father-in-law. But how it got here is going to be a mystery. There is one last interesting detail. I don't believe in coincidence. As a rule, there's cause and effect. There's a series of events that happen. So here's what's interesting. One last little detail. In the lower right hand of the SAM's schematic for the GRT1, that would be SAM set 310 folder 6. That's what you will find in the lower right hand corner of the schematic for the GRT1, the notation 310. The Harman Kardon, presumed to be based on that, which came out in October of the same year, is the model 310. Make of that what you will. I think the number 310 isn't an accident, and it isn't a coincidence. I think that Harman Kardon just took the most efficient way out. But that final piece of irony is what proves to me beyond any reasonable doubt that the Harman Kardon A310 AM/FM 12-tube superhet tuner was in fact manufactured by Grommes Precision based on Grommes' own GRT1 platform and just adapted to meet Harman Kardon's requirements. End of story, period. That's it.